Well, joining me now is McElvoy, executive editor of Politico and co-host of the joint podcast Politics at Sam and Anne's. And thank you so much for joining us. Your reaction to this news, which I guess wasn't exactly unexpected.
I don't think it was unexpected, but I think if you have things that happen on a Sunday afternoon like this, if you start your breakfast with David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister, making clear that he's distancing himself through proxies, but he is distancing himself from Keir Starmer's decision to appoint Peter Mandelson. Then you have Morgan McSweeney, who has put up his hands and said, yes, it was me who particularly wanted to have Peter Mandelson back in that prominent role, one of our own, doyen of the Blair years, in Washington, but also so they could get a Labour character close in on Keir Starmer's team. And then to have to say, actually, the Prime Minister's now ended up in such trouble over it that I'm resigning on a Sunday. I mean, I was certainly being briefed, and I'm sure others were too, as late as Friday, that the Prime Minister didn't want Morgan McSweeney to go, at least not now. He wanted a sense of getting hold of that timeline, getting back in control of the pace of events. I think what this goes to show, we heard it there very well from Beth in her upsum, is there is no control. This is really about trying to protect Keir Starmer, prevent him from having to think about throwing in the towel by saying, look, why don't you just have the head of my chief advisor instead? I'd be dubious about how long that will hold.
Yeah. And I wonder, how damaged do you think Keir Starmer will be now by the loss of Morgan McSweeney, on the backdrop, of course, of everything else that's happened in the week, and generally his position within the party and in the polls as well?
Well, I come back to the fact that if you can't control the timeline in politics, then you really have a big problem, because what they wanted to roll out, Morgan McSweeney, I think, would have agreed with this. Keir Starmer had said it quite openly on Friday when he was out and about, saying, I understand that I can't be seen to be getting on with things that I really want to do to deliver for the country as Prime Minister because of these Mandelson revelations. I think the idea was possibly to keep Morgan McSweeney in place, go through these next torrid weeks. He's still, was until about an hour ago, a very treasured and close advisor to Keir Starmer. That was one reason I think that Starmer and others on the team, they know that Starmer is lonely. They know that he finds it difficult. He finds the job difficult. He's accused of outsourcing a lot of key strategy decisions. So I think he will absolutely miss having Morgan McSweeney at hand. But the fact is that McSweeney is the only insulation that he has had left on the appointment of Peter Mandelson. So the very clear statement, Morgan McSweeney, warts and all, knows how to write a clear resignation statement saying, this, it was me, I did push for this appointment, and therefore I take the fall on it. That is pretty much the last step before you swing for the king, in this case, the prime ministerial king, the political king, in Keir Starmer. But the trouble is, it means that, you've used up any potential you had to keep him in place through these bad elections, which are around the corner in the next 3 months. And I think that is a problem. Now you've left the prime minister exposed to the body blows.
Yeah, I mean, elections that were going to be difficult anyway. Do you think that Morgan McSweeney standing down will be enough to pacify many of the backbenchers?
I think it will in the short term. They wanted some red meat, so they got the red head, we can see there. They got what they wanted. But you see, I think the bigger problem with that, I'm just writing a column, as we speak, on my other hand, so saying that the problem is once that your authority goes, the backbenchers are saying who should go, who should stay. Your deputy prime minister is saying, oh, well, I wouldn't have done it this way, mate. So what you lose is that invisible cloak of authority. You, as Prime Minister, you just seem to be driven by events so you can get through things. People talk a lot about the backbenchers. Dearly as we love them, but they're Westminster. But it is actually often people very close to the Prime Minister. It's their loyalty that matters in the end. If you think of former deputy prime ministers who stuck the knife in and leaders didn't survive, Geoffrey Howe under Margaret Thatcher would be an example. Gordon Brown as Chancellor, similar kind of role, even if it wasn't deputy prime minister. So now you have the point reached where you appease people by saying, look, here is the head of someone you didn't like. You didn't like his autocratic style in Downing Street. But what are you left with? Who's advising you? Who's protecting you? And that protective layer today for Keir Starmer, who's clearly decided, by the way, that he does want to fight on. That's perhaps one thing that's sort of dawned on me a bit as we've been speaking, is This weekend, a lot of people wondered if Keir Starmer was going to come out by Monday saying, I've had enough of this, or this week, I can't see a path out of this. This goes to show Keir Starmer does want to fight on, but who is the army behind him?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in the statement from Morgan McSweeney, he says it specifically. He says, when I advised the Prime Minister to make that appointment, I take responsibility for that advice. So he's responsible for the advice. Ultimately, the Prime Minister is responsible for the decision, and the question over his judgment remains.
That's right. The question over his judgment remains. At least he can say, well, there was someone close to me pressing for it. But I think you're right. You don't get away from the misjudgment. The question it doesn't answer, which I think is going to come back very insistently, and more so when we see perhaps even more material as everyone scrapes through the files and subsequent revelations now that the government is saying it will release pretty much everything that is not seen as being too national security focused. We're going to get a lot of very embarrassing detail. Is also, yes, Morgan McSweeney wanted Peter Mandelson, but also Keir Starmer is a former director of public prosecutions and one of the country's most senior lawyers, who in the end accepted having Peter Mandelson fully knowing, and this was all in the public domain, and was pointed out by the FT and others, that he'd continued a relationship with Peter Mandelson, including staying in his house after a conviction for sex with underage girls. And that, I think, is the point on which, having been told by your advisor that Peter Mandelson's a cool guy and that you really can't imagine Labour without him, you do still wonder, what was it around Keir Starmer where his judgment, but also the kind of judgment he's shown very well in his legal career, one should say. This was extraordinary. It failed because the desire to have Peter Mandelson in the job was so great. And that will be the question. Why?
In his resignation statement at the end, Morgan McSweeney makes 2 points. One, that we must remember the women and girls whose lives were ruined by Epstein. But secondly, he talks about the due diligence and vetting process. He says that he didn't oversee it, but he believes the process must be fundamentally overhauled. Do you think it was a problem with the process, or do you think it was the Mandelson figure, someone that has such a sway over the party and has had for so many years?
Well, 2 points on that. I'm sure Morgan McSweeney is genuine on the point about the women and the girls, but I must say I'm finding it difficult to keep hearing this from people who have not mentioned this for such a long time. They weren't focused on the women and the girls when they ignored that long-standing evidence about Epstein's close relationship with Peter Mandelson. So I'm not even sure what it means. I mean, other than we realise this is something that sounds terrible for a government, which is also in fairness to the government, has been trying to make strides on violence against women and girls, including sexual violence. So the fact is, and this does speak to a very male team, not only, it's not the only bit of politics, they're very male teams, but they do seem to have kind of missed it. So, I mean, it's a bit belated, this concern for the women and the girls, frankly. I think I would have a bit more respect for if they said, look, we have not focused on this enough and we apologise. I think that's what we need to hear. Whether the vetting process should be overhauled, I mean, please, everything's going to be overhauled. So as Morgan McSweeney well knows, this is a big state crisis in Britain. Everything is going to be overhauled so that it can't happen again. On the vetting, there were 2 levels of it. On the second, the protective one is supposed to stop really bad stuff from happening. I mean, my information from people close to Peter Mandelson is that it lasted less than 20 minutes. Now, I'm sure there was other available information put in a file and handed to the Prime Minister and to Morgan McSweeney, probably. But, to say the process failed, it depends. If you wanted the vetting to be more thorough, you could have asked for more thorough vetting. It collapses in on itself as an excuse. I think Morgan McSweeney is doing what he considers to be the right thing now, which is to protect the principle, and the principle here for him is Keir Starmer. But that is really, I think, everything else is words in the wind and will be quickly overtaken by events.
And obviously there's the issue about Mandelson being appointed as US ambassador, and then what's come up in the latest tranche of files, the suggestion that he shared market-sensitive information when he was a minister with Epstein. So those are specific political issues. But we spoke to Baroness Hazarika a little earlier in the day, who spoke about this actually being about male power and a boys' club that didn't really care about women one way or another. Do you think, or rather, how big a reason do you think that is for the anger, the fury that we're seeing within the Labour Party now?
I think that is considerable, and I think that is also something where Labour Party, has some introspection to conduct. And I certainly don't only mean that Labour as a party has this problem, which is a way of looking at things as if it's about the appointments of powerful men, in this case, all powerful men, as we've seen, just watching the screen that you're showing now. This is what we're seeing, and that this any other sense of another angle, it was a blind spot. It's clearly been a blind spot. Would it have changed had there been more women in and around the advisory circle? I've always said that when you get into advisory circles, and I know there are very many prominent women who have been close to prime ministers, to chancellors, etc., but overwhelmingly, I think you do see that. I'm also, by the way, not saying that some women would not equally have had a blind spot. They would have been focused on serving their prime minister, and as they see it, getting the transatlantic relationship in this transactional mode that we are now in the Donald Trump era, of getting that functioning. But at the same time, if you've got a disconnect where you have had grooming gangs on Labour's watch just because of where it mainly arose, not only, but principally in a lot of Labour parts of the country. And there was notoriously a blind spot around that. Shabana Mahmood, as Home Secretary, I think is coming close to saying that pretty frequently, that lots and lots of things have really not been to the advantage of women. Then you really have to ask yourself, why did that not figure? Why was it not seen as relevant? I mean, did anybody say, how is this going to appear when it clashes with our agenda on protecting women and girls and on sexualized violence? There was a disconnect. One thing was seen as more important than another. And in a way, I'd rather have someone come out and say, this is very damaging and I take this on board. I wonder now whether Keir Starmer has passed the point where that is credible for him.
We'll have to see. Anne McElvoy, executive editor of Politico and co-host of the joint podcast Politics at Sam and Anne's. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.